I want to take a look at Matthew 17:21 because this is an interesting variant. As I began looking at it, it actually became a more important variant than I had initially thought. And so this is Jesus, Orthodox present. Oh, interesting. Okay. So I initially saw this, and as I was studying, it became apparent that this is actually more important. This is a more important variant than we initially thought. And there's a little more riding on it. Normally we would say something like, there's no textual variants that affect doctrine and stuff, but I think this one kind of does. And it has to be teamed up with another passage for you to see what it does. But yeah, so when it comes to demonology and casting out demons and that kind of stuff, that this is clearly an important verse, right? So in Jesus' teaching, the disciples come to him and they're like, we're so excited, and or no, that wasn't it. I'm getting it wrong. I'm getting my story mixed up. Why don't we come to the context and I'll read it and then I won't get mixed up. And Jesus rebuked the devil and he departed out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. So Jesus just performed an exorcism essentially. Then came the disciples to Jesus apart and said, why could we not cast him out? And Jesus said unto them, because of your unbelief. For verily I say unto you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, remove hence yonder place, and it shall be removed, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Howbeit, this kind goeth not out by prayer and fasting. So he's talking about this specific kind of devil. There's something unique to this devil, which requires both prayer and fasting to cast it out. Now, let's just talk a little bit about casting out devils. Now, I'm a Pentecostal pastor. I believe that people can be demon possessed today. I think that can happen. We see that in the scriptures. We see Jesus, like examples here where Jesus is casting out a demon. The one example with the pigs, the demon goes out into the pigs, the unclean spirit, and all the pigs go flying off the edge of the cliff, and everybody's in fear. And of course, the guys, understandably, they just saw their entire herd of pigs go over the ledge, and they, kind of go from here. But anyway, interesting conversations too between the demons and Jesus. Have you come here to torment us before our time? They're talking back to him, and they recognize his authority, and they go when they tell him, right? When Jesus tells them, they go. Now, can that still happen today? I see no reason at all in the scripture. There's no reason at all to suggest that demons were eradicated between the time of the New Testament and today. Nothing. There's just nothing. There's nothing in the scriptures that say that. So we have this whole thing about demons and people being demon possessed. And I'm sure if you look out at the world today, you could probably think of someone who's probably demon possessed just by the way they act or their interest or whatever it is. So the question becomes, how do you get them out? Right? Now, I think, you see all these guys online and you see a whole bunch of theatrics surrounding or casting out demons, and, people turning their heads every which way and people yelling and screaming, and you get frauds like Catherine Crick who go out there and hire actors to do all these things. Okay. I think we as a church, not we as a church, but I think it's been kind of propped up a little bit and exaggerated and made greater than it is. Most times, casting out demons is really no more than just telling it to leave in the name of Jesus. Just praying and asking God to take care of it, and it goes, right? And that's kind of the authority that's given to us by Jesus. So the authority in his name to cast out demons. Sure, okay, it's all good. Now, could somebody get all crazy and do crazy things? It happened in the scriptures. So if it happened in the scripture and there's no reason to suggest that it stopped from the New Testament to today, then it probably could happen today. I've heard some interesting stories. It doesn't happen like that most of the time. But anyway, yeah. So with that being said, I don't want to concentrate so much on casting out spirits. That's like another channel kind of thing. But it comes down to this question here of this verse in Matthew 17, verse 21. So in Matthew 17:21, howbeit this kind goeth not out by prayer and fasting. So this verse, again, is not in the critical text. Now, is it a big deal that it's not in the critical text? Initially I thought, well, probably not, because if you go to Mark, I got it here, Mark 9, 29. So if you go to Mark 9:29, you see a very similar event, or it probably is the same event. And he says in Mark 9:29, and he said unto them, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. Okay, good. King James Version. So why is this interesting? Okay, so initially my thinking was, well, in Matthew 17, it's not a big deal because we have it written in Mark 9, and so it's still in there, but by prayer and fasting, and it's all good, and we know that fasting is required to cast out demons. Now, you can make the case that fasting is good to do anyway, but in the King James Version, in the Byzantine text, we're making an explicit case that there are some devils that require not just prayer, but fasting. So if you go and take a look at this verse in a modern translation, let's do NASB Mark 9. What was that again? 29. So if you look at a modern translation, watch this. And he said to them, this kind cannot come out by anything except prayer. Oh, where's the fasting bit? Where's the fasting bit? It doesn't say fasting there. So if you go in the same in the same Bible translation, the New American Standard Bible. Now, I just happen to pick this one. It's going to be the same in the ESV and all these things. But if you go back to our passage in Matthew 17, okay, this is the passage, Matthew 17:21, I believe it was. Did I get that wrong? Matthew 17. No, I don't know why that didn't come. Yeah, so if you come back to Matthew 17:21, that's why it didn't show up. It didn't show up because 21 doesn't exist here, right? Verse 21 doesn't exist in the NASB. So any passage that we would have that would encourage us to fast when casting out a demon, like Jesus told the disciples, they do not exist at all. This would be a Christian doctrine that is affected, I would think, in the critical text, right? Because the New American Standard, the two variant readings from Matthew and Mark in fasting and prayer, they both leave out fasting. So now there's no verse in the scriptures that tell us to fast or encourage us to fast when casting out demons. So this is important. This is an important one. Now, it's interesting because when I was talking with Dr. Black, when I was talking with Dr. Black, there was a textual variant in there. I forget which one it was, but it was referencing the omniscience of Jesus, who is in heaven. That's what I can't remember where it was. You have to go back and view it. But again, this is another doctrine that doesn't hang on very many scriptures. And so when you take out who is in heaven, you end up removing half of the passages, because there's only one other, that refers to the omniscience of Jesus, the other one being in Mark 16. Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. So you take those two passages out, and then you don't have much on the omniscience of Jesus. These are interesting. Now, is it going to destroy the faith and destroy, doctrine? No, but these doctrines are important, and I want them all intact, right? I didn't catch this with prayer and fasting until I looked at them both, because the critical text removes fasting from both of them, from both Matthew 17 and Mark 9. So anyway, if I pulled up this article here from Got Questions. I like Got Questions. It's very skewed to a modern text critical view. They kind of take the popular view on this. But the question is, why did Jesus say that demons could only come out by prayer and fasting? So Mark 9 records a remarkable episode of Jesus casting out an evil spirit. I think we talked all about that. Yeah. Later the disciples, so this has Got Questions. Later the disciples privately asked Jesus why they could not cast out the unclean spirit. And Jesus replied that the particular kind could only come out by prayer and fasting, while the King James Version records Jesus as saying that the demons in Mark 9 could only come out by prayer and fasting. Other translations, and basically all the modern translations minus MEV and NKJV, leave out and fasting and only mention prayer. The difference is due to some translations' use of older and less numerous copies of manuscripts. Now, this is interesting. The use of older and less numerous copies of manuscripts. And that's true. So if we come back to my notes here, this is how it stacks up. Let me make that nice and big so you can see that really well. But this is how it stacks up. 87% of all manuscripts include the Matthew 17:21 prayer and fasting verse. Okay, it includes it. It's for its inclusion. And only 0.6 are for its exclusion. Now, if you go and take a look at Mark, because Mark also has a variant there, which is what we're talking about, 99.7% of the manuscripts have and fasting in there. And fasting. 99.7. That's 0.3. So the ECM actually has a split line there because they're not sure what to do with it, because they seem to think that maybe they just got it from Mark. But then you have the question of, well, then if you don't think Mark is original, then he didn't get it from Mark. And then there's the question of Mark and Matthean priority. Well, what came first, Mark or Matthew? There's some question there, I guess. But it's interesting. So the ECM split lines it, but the Nestle All-in text just doesn't have it. They obviously have it in the apparatus, but the critical text is favoring the idea of leaving that out. But that the point there is, it's not just a majority that has and fasting, or these don't come out by prayer and fasting. Or these only come out by prayer and fasting. It's the vast majority. It's not just the majority. It's a vast majority. So that's just to comment on what they're saying here and got questions, right? The translation's use of older and less numerous copies of manuscripts. While the King James Version translate from some of the more recent and more numerous. Some. How about almost all of them? That would be more accurate reflection. Anyway, so sometimes the manuscripts will have slight differences, often referred to as textual variants. Mark 6:9-29 is an example of a passage with a variant. Now, I wouldn't call that a slight variant. Like I said, if you take the critical text position, then you do not have any reference as being original, or you don't have any reference to fasting as being original when taking care of demonic oppression. So now, again, you could make the case that it just makes sense, right? And there we go. The common sense thing, right? You just fast forward a little or rewind a little bit, and you can hear my talk about common sense. You could take a common sense approach and say, maybe we should just fast when we do. And I mean, as a practice, generally Christians will fast when they have important things that are happening, or important decisions to make, or important things to pray about, or maybe they just want to get closer to God. So you fast. So no issues with that, but it's taking out an explicit reference to fasting. And so how would I say this? It's not connecting fasting to deliverance when I think it should be. While there are many variants in the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, it is remarkable that none of the variants create any significant doctrinal challenge. But this one kind of does. I mean, depending on what you mean by significant, I mean, it doesn't touch the cardinal rules of the faith, but it does touch on demon possession and deliverance. They are usually minor and don't impact the message of a passage at all. This one does, in my opinion. In Mark 9:29 is one of the more significant variants. Nothing's, they're usually minor. They don't impact, but this one is important. As differing translations make it unclear whether the demon could only come out by prayer and fasting, or whether prayer alone would work. So there's like a recognition here that this is kind of an important variant. It is worth noting that in the New Testament, fasting was simply prayer so focused and intense that a person did not give attention to the things like eating or drinking. Now, it's really interesting that they make that statement, but they don't provide any passages to back that claim up, because we got to be really... Fasting is just one of those things. Now you're going to get a little bit of a rant, right? Fasting is one of those things we're not good at in the West, right? We're not good at it. We just don't fast, right? Because we live in a society that has all this delicious food. It's yummy. It's tasty. Fill my belly. I will be a glutton. Actually, I did a preach on gluttony once. I had to taper down my own gluttony for a while before I could preach that message. But yeah, we don't fast in the West as often because we're just so used to all the food, and we like to eat all the food, and we have all the sugar and all the stuff in the food that tastes really good. So fasting, you cannot separate fasting from not eating. If you are eating, you're not fasting. And so to say that, well, it's just because you're simply prayer is so focused and intense that, you don't give attention to things like eating. I think fasting is much more than that. I think this is way too simple of a definition for fasting. But again, that's another question for a day. But by taking the definition of fasting and simplifying it in this way, tends to make the textual variant less severe, or makes you think the textual variant is less severe than it is. Either way, Jesus is emphasizing that the demon in Mark 9 could only come out by intensive prayer. But you see, he didn't say intensive prayer, right? I think it's James. He talks about the fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, right? In the King James, the fervent prayer of a righteous man. So it didn't say fasting, although fasting could be part of that fervent prayer. But I don't necessarily know if fasting is part of fervent prayer. So again, you have this whole idea here of changing the definition of fasting. Or maybe not changing the definition, but at the very least, it's simplifying fasting. And why are they doing that in this Got Questions article? I think it's because they're trying to make the variant in Mark 9:29 seem like not as big of a deal as it is. Again, I'm not going to put terrible motives on the guys who wrote the articles. I've benefited tremendously from Got Questions, right? I use their stuff all the time. They got generally speaking, it's good stuff. But I think they missed it here. Now, as Jesus explains to the crowd, the key was the faith of those involved. Yes, the faith is important. It's in there. So it is evident that prayer rooted in faith in Jesus Christ is effective. See James' assertion that the prayer of a righteous person is effective. Oh, look at that. They touched on that. Jesus was challenging the crowd, the boy's father and the disciples, on the importance of believing in him as the one who could accomplish what would otherwise be impossible. See, again, we read that, and I don't think that he was challenging the crowd necessarily when he was answering the questions of the disciples. So anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on that because I'd have to look at it some more just to be a little more certain on what I'm saying there. But anyway, that's one example, just kind of gone through with a little bit more of a fine-tooth comb. I think this one, Matthew 17:21, Mark 9, it's an important variant because without it, right? Like if you take fasting out, it's out of both in the critical methodology.